The rain came sideways off the Sonoran Plateau, the way rain sometimes does in Arizona in October. Not the gentle kind that people from wetter places take for granted, but the aggressive kind, the kind that finds every gap in a man's jacket and reminds him that the desert is not actually friendly. It is merely dry most of the time, and when it decides to be wet about it, it means the whole thing. Hank Dawson had been riding since 5 in the morning, not because he had somewhere particular to be. He had been riding for a long time now, without somewhere particular to be, and the habit had settled over him the way habits do when they stop being choices and start being just the shape of your days. He was 63 years old. He had been riding with the Hells Angels since he was 21, and for the first 4 decades of that life, the road had meant something specific, had meant brotherhood and motion, and the particular freedom of men who had decided that freedom was worth the cost. Now the road mostly meant forward, and forward mostly meant away from wherever he had been when the last thing happened. The last thing had been Fletcher. He saw the diner from the highway, a low building sitting back from the road, with the apologetic posture of roadside establishments in small desert towns. Places that know they are running on borrowed time and have stopped pretending otherwise. The sign above the door read, "Desert Star," and one of the letters was missing. Had been missing for a while based on the weathering around the gap. The parking lot had 2 cracks running through it wide enough to be a problem in the dark. He pulled in, not because he was hungry, not because he had planned to stop in Redemption, Arizona, because the rain was getting worse and he was 63 years old and there was a lit window, and he was not so proud as he used to be. He pushed through the door. The bell above it made a sound like something tired, and the heat hit him immediately. The dry institutional warmth of a kitchen that had been running since well before dawn. The diner was small, 8 stools at a counter, 6 booths along the front windows, most of them cracked along the seat seams, a jukebox in the corner that nobody had fed money to recently, the kind of tiles on the floor that were original and had stopped being vintage and started being just old somewhere around the second Reagan administration. A handful of customers. A man at the counter with his hat still on reading a newspaper that was 3 days old. 2 older women sharing pie in the far booth. A couple of road workers in the middle who had the look of men who ate here most days and had run out of new things to say to each other. Hank took the corner table near the window, back to the wall, facing the room and the door both. 40 years of being the kind of man he was had built certain habits into his body that no amount of ordinary living was going to unbuild. He took off his jacket and folded it on the bench beside him. Underneath it, he was wearing a flannel shirt over a thermal, and over the flannel shirt he wore his vest. 42 years of patches. Chapter designation: Road Captain. The Hells Angels death head on the back that people in places like Redemption, Arizona sometimes looked at for a beat too long before they looked away. He ordered coffee. The woman who brought it to him was in her early 30s, blonde hair and a ponytail name tag that read, Sadie. She moved with the specific economy of someone who had been doing this long enough to have removed the unnecessary parts. She looked tired in a way that was not about sleep. He had seen that kind of tired before, had worn it himself for enough years to recognize it on someone else without needing to be told what caused it. The coffee was good, genuinely good. He wrapped both hands around the mug and looked out the rain-streaked window at the empty highway and the flat gray distance of the desert in weather. He was not thinking about anything particular. He had learned how to do that, how to sit in a room and let the surface of his mind go still, It was something the military had started, and 40 years of riding had finished. The ability to be completely present in a place without needing the place to be anything other than what it was. He was on his second cup when the man came out of the back office, 38 years old, medium build, medium height. The kind of unremarkable physical presence that certain men compensate for with the authority of their position. He was wearing a shirt with a chain logo on the chest pocket, and he carried a printout in one hand and an expression that meant someone in his immediate vicinity was about to have a bad morning. He walked past the counter without acknowledging anyone and went straight to where Sadie was clearing the two-top by the kitchen. Hank watched. He was not watching, obviously. He was looking at his coffee. But he was watching. The man held up the printout. He said something Hank could not fully hear from across the room. His voice was at the controlled volume of a man who has learned to deliver bad news at a pitch that the person receiving it can hear. But bystanders are supposed to miss. Sadie answered something. The man answered back. His voice tightened. Hank could hear the tightening even if he could not hear the specific words. And then the man's hand came up. The crack of it across Sadie's face silenced the diner. Not a full swing. A slap. The practice kind. The kind a man delivers when he wants to establish where power lives in a situation and has done it before and expects the situation to respond by organizing itself accordingly. It landed on her left cheek and snapped her head to the right, and she caught the edge of the table nearest to her to keep herself upright. The sound of it was very loud in a quiet room. And then the room was quieter. The man at the counter looked at his newspaper. The two women in the far booth found something in their pie that required close attention. The road workers in the middle became very interested in their coffee cups. The room organized itself the way rooms organize when something has happened that everyone present has decided did not happen, the collective decision of 20 people to be somewhere else in their minds while remaining physically present. Hank set down his coffee cup very slowly, with a deliberateness that was not about the cup. He did not look away. Sadie had straightened. Her cheek was marked. Her eyes had filled with the involuntary water that the body produces when struck, whether the person wants it to or not. And she was doing the work of not letting it become something more. Her jaw set, her hands still on the table edge, her spine doing the job of holding her upright, even while the rest of her was somewhere else, dealing with something she did not want anyone to see her deal with. The man straightened his collar, said something else, short, dismissive, went back into the office and closed the door. The room stayed quiet for another 10 seconds. Then it went back to being a diner. Hank sat still for a moment. He looked at the table in front of him. He looked at the office door. He looked at Sadie, who was moving carefully around the table she had been clearing, doing the work of pretending the work was all there was. He stood up. He crossed the diner without hurrying. He did not make any particular noise about it. He simply moved from his corner table to where Sadie was working, and he stopped, and he waited until she looked up. She looked up. He said, "Are you all right?" Not the social version of the question. Not the version that contains the expectation of yes, so we can move on. The plain version. The version that actually wanted to know. She said, "I am fine." He looked at her cheek. He did not say anything about it. He just nodded once. He said, "The coffee is very good." She blinked. The non sequitur landed differently than she expected it to. Something around her eyes softened by a degree. She said, Ruth does the morning pots mostly. I do the afternoon. He said, "Tell Ruth I said so." He took out his wallet, left a 20 on the nearest table for a bill that was $8, started to turn. She said, "Thank you." He paused. He looked at her for a moment. He said, "For what?" She did not answer that. She just looked at him with the eyes of a woman who had been in a room full of people who chose not to see something and was trying to recalibrate what it meant that this one had. He went back to his corner table. He sat down. He drank his coffee. He looked out the window at the rain. He ordered pie when she came back around. Apple. She brought it without much comment. He ate it slowly. She refilled his coffee twice without being asked. Around 10 o'clock, the two road workers left, and the man at the counter put down his newspaper and followed shortly after. The diner got quieter. Hank sat. He was not in a hurry. He had not been in a hurry for several months. Hurrying implied a destination, and destinations implied the future was organized in a way that rewarded arrival. He had not been able to believe that for a while. Around 10:30, Sadie brought herself a glass of water and came to stand at the end of his table. She did not sit down. She stood with her back to the rest of the room and held her water glass and looked at him. She said, "You are not from here." He said, "No." She said, "Passing through." He said, "That was the plan." She looked out the window at the highway at the rain still working its way across the desert from the northwest, at the particular emptiness of the land beyond the road. She said, "There is not much that makes people stop in redemption." He said, "A diner with good coffee and a rainstorm." She almost smiled. The smile did not fully arrive, but the space where it would have been was visible. He said, "You have family here." She said, "My mother is in Flagstaff. I stayed when she left." He waited. She said, "My husband." 2 words, delivered in the specific flat key of someone who has said a thing so many times in the past months that the saying of it has become its own separate practice. The discipline of making those 2 words not break something in your face every time they come out. He said, "How long?" She said, 6 months. He said, "I am sorry." And he meant it in his way that people mean things when the words are not adequate. But there are no adequate words, and saying the inadequate ones is still better than saying nothing. She said, "He was a mechanic. Roy Colton." Hank went still, not a visible stillness. He did not put down his coffee cup or change his posture or do anything that a person watching from across the room would have clocked as a reaction. But inside, in the place where he had learned over 63 years of being in situations that required stillness, something locked into place with a precision that he recognized. The precision of a thing he had been moving toward for 4 months, finally coming close enough to touch. Roy Colton. The name Fletcher had written down on a piece of paper in a motel room in Flagstaff 6 days before he died. The mechanic in redemption who had found something, who had documented something, who had died on Route 9 in the early hours of a Thursday morning 6 months ago, when his brake line failed on a curve that he had driven 100 times. Roy Colton, who had been Sadie Colton's husband. Hank set his cup down, carefully, the way you set something down when you need your hands free for what comes next. He said, "Tell me how he died." She looked at him. The question had arrived without the social preamble that questions like that are supposed to arrive with. No, I heard something, or I might know something, or there may be a connection. Just tell me how he died. A man asking a question that already knew the general shape of the answer and needed the specifics. She said, they said it was an accident. Brake failure. Route 9 north of town. The investigation closed in 48 hours. He said Sheriff Loomis ran the investigation. It was not a question. The way he said it was not a question. She looked at him with something shifting in her face. She was smart enough to hear what the absence of question in his voice meant. She said, yes. He said, were the brakes serviced recently? She said Roy serviced his own truck every other week. He was meticulous about it. He kept records. A notebook in the glove box with every service date written down in his own handwriting. He said, was the notebook there when they found the truck? The question landed on her like something dropped from a height. She had not thought to ask that. Or she had thought to ask it and had nowhere to take the asking. Either way, her face told him the notebook had not been mentioned in any report, and she had not known until this moment that it should have been. She sat down across from him. She sat down the way people sit down when their legs have made a decision before their brain did. She said, who are you? He reached into the inside pocket of his vest. He took out a photograph. Old, slightly faded, the edges rounded from years of being carried. He set it on the table between them. Two men on motorcycles. Desert background. Sun in their eyes. Both grinning at whoever was behind the camera with the specific grin of men who are exactly where they want to be. Hank, 20 years younger and thinner in the face and with considerably more hair, but the same eyes, the same posture. And beside him a man of similar age, dark-haired, wider across the shoulders, a vest with the same patches. She looked at the photograph. She looked at him. He said his name was Fletcher Ames. He was my brother. Not blood. The kind that matters more. He let her look at the photograph. He said 4 months ago, Fletcher died on Route 12 outside of a town called Mineral Wells, 60 miles north of here. Single vehicle accident. Brake failure. The investigation closed in 48 hours. Sheriff Earl Loomis signed the closure. The diner was very quiet. The rain had eased outside but not stopped. The jukebox in the corner did not play anything. The kitchen was still. She looked up from the photograph. She said Fletcher was looking into Roy. He said Fletcher came here because I asked him to. I was not able to come myself at the time. I was still recovering from an accident of my own, and I trusted Fletcher the way you trust a man you have ridden with for 20 years and who has never given you a reason not to. He paused. He said I had heard about Roy's death through a contact in Phoenix. Someone who tracks cases that close too fast. They flagged Roy's case to me because of the timeline and because brake failure findings that come before independent inspection are a pattern that means something specific. I sent Fletcher to look. He said, and a week after he arrived in Redemption, Fletcher was dead. She was not crying. She was doing the thing he had watched her do when Vaught hit her the jaw set, and the deliberate stillness of a woman who has developed very good control over what her face does. But her hands on the table were pressing flat against the surface, and he could see the pressure in them from across the table. He said, I have been to 5 other towns in 4 months, looking at this pattern from every angle I could find. Redemption is the 6th town. And when I came through that door this morning, I did not know that Roy Colton was your husband. I did not know you existed. I stopped because it was raining and because this was the nearest open light. She looked at him for a long time. She said, "And now?" He said, "Now I know where the center of this is." The door of the diner opened. Both of them tracked it involuntarily, the reflex that develops when you have been in a situation long enough to understand that every person who enters a room changes the room. The woman who came out of the kitchen instead was in her early 60s, wide-shouldered, gray hair in a braid. She wore a work apron over her clothes, and she moved with the purposeful economy of someone who had been running this particular room for a long time and understood it completely. She looked at Sadie first, then at Hank, at his vest. She said to Sadie, "You need anything?" Sadie said, "I am all right, Ruth." Ruth looked at Hank with the expression of a woman who has survived long enough to know the difference between a man who is dangerous to a place and a man who is dangerous to the things that threaten a place. She had not decided which category he occupied yet, but she was deciding. She went back to the kitchen without saying anything else. Hank watched her go. He said, "She has known you a long time." Sadie said, 22 years, since I was 6. Her and Roy were close. She was the one he called when something was wrong and he did not want to worry me. He filed this. He filed everything in the way of a man who had spent 22 years in the military learning that information is weight and weight is leverage, and you do not leave leverage on the table. He said Roy knew something before he died. It was not a question either. She said, "I think so. I have thought so for 6 months, but I could not prove it, and I did not know who to take it to." He said, "Loomis." She said, "Loomis has been by the diner 3 times since Roy died. Each time he says he is checking in. Each time he says it friendly. Each time what he is actually saying is that he knows I am alone and that Roy is gone, and that whatever Roy knew, if I start asking the wrong questions in the wrong places, I should understand what that means." He looked at her. She said, "He said Roy owed people with long memories. He said it the way he says everything, like he is doing me a favor by telling me." Hank looked at the table. He thought about Fletcher in a motel room in Flagstaff, writing Roy Colton's name on a piece of paper and putting it in an envelope and mailing it to Hank the same day. The envelope had arrived 2 days after Fletcher was dead. Hank had read the name and the notes Fletcher had made, and then he had sat in his kitchen for 3 hours and not moved. He said, "The man who hit you this morning." She said, "Dennis Vaught. He manages the diner for the chain that owns it." He said, "He called someone after I pulled him aside." She said, "He is afraid of Loomis. Most people in this town are afraid of Loomis. Dennis calls him when things seem off. Loomis told him to. He said Loomis will come here today." She said, "Probably." He said, "When he does. Let me see how he acts when he sees me." She looked at him. He said, "That is all I'm asking. Not for you to do anything. Not for you to say anything. I want to watch a man's face when he walks into a room and finds a problem." He was not expecting. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "You are going to stay." He said, "Yes." She said, "You have been at 6 towns in 4 months, and you think this is the one." He said, "I think this is where it is centered." "Yes." She looked out the window at the highway, at the desert beyond it, at the enormous flat indifference of the Arizona landscape that had been here before anyone in this story existed and would be here long after. She said Roy would have wanted someone to come. He was the kind of man who believed in that, in people showing up. Hank said nothing. He picked up his coffee. She stood up and went back to work. He stayed. He watched the room. He watched the parking lot through the rain-blurred window. He ate a full lunch when the noon hour came, the chicken fried steak that Ruth Greer made with the confidence of a woman who has been making the same thing well for 20 years and has stopped needing to think about it. He drank 4 cups of coffee and left correct tips and said nothing that required a response. At 2:15, the door opened. Hank was looking at the window when it opened, but he clocked it in his peripheral vision. The way he clocked everything, and he did not turn. He let the room tell him what had come in. The room tightened, not loudly, not dramatically. The kind of tightening that happens in a place when a specific weight has entered it. The road worker at the near table shifted in his seat. Ruth, visible through the pass-through window, turned from the grill and then turned back. Sadie, who had been moving between tables with her usual efficiency, slowed by perhaps half a step. Hank turned. Sheriff Earl Loomis was in his mid-50s, carrying extra weight in the way that men carry extra weight when the weight has arrived slowly over decades, and the man has stopped noticing. He had a wide, pale face and pale eyes and a way of moving through a space that was more proprietary than physical. The movement of a man who considers every room he enters to be a room that has agreed to belong to him. He was not in uniform. Dark jacket, plain clothes. His own truck outside, not the cruiser. Off the record. He sat at the counter. He ordered coffee without looking at the menu because men like him do not look at menus in places they consider to be theirs. He talked to Sadie when she brought it. About the weather. About the road construction up on the highway. About whether Ruth had changed the pie recipe because he thought he detected something different in the crust. He talked the way powerful men talk in rooms they have decided they own, with his eyes moving and his voice on the surface about nothing and underneath the voice on the specific thing he had come to look at. He looked at Hank twice in 7 minutes. Hank caught both. On the second look, their eyes met. Hank did not look away. He held it for a measured moment, and then he returned to his coffee. Loomis drank his coffee slowly. Spoke to Sadie twice more. Said nothing to Hank directly. After 20 minutes, he left a 5 on the counter for a $2 coffee, and he patted the counter twice with his palm, the gesture of a man approving something, and he walked to the door. He paused at the door. 1 beat. 2. Then he was gone. The diner exhaled. Ruth came out from the kitchen. She leaned against the far end of the counter with her arms folded and looked at the door and then looked at Hank. She said, "He knew you were here before he walked in." Hank said, "Yes." She said, "Dennis called him." He said, "Almost certainly." She looked at him for a moment with something working in her face. She was 61 years old and had run this diner for 22 years, and she had buried a husband and raised a daughter alone and survived 2 floods and 1 recession that would have ended most places. She did not scare easy, but she was scared of something adjacent to this. She had been carrying something for 8 months, and the weight of it was visible in the set of her jaw. He said, "Ruth." She looked at him. He said, "Roy left something with you." It was not entirely a question. He could see it in her. The way a person looks who has been holding something dangerous and has almost forgotten they are holding it because they have gotten so practiced at pretending they are not. She said, "How do you know that?" He said, "Because Roy was a meticulous man. You have known him for years. He trusted you, and he knew what he had found, and he knew what it meant, and he was smart enough not to put everything in one place." She looked at him for a long time. She said, "Who sent you?" He said, "My brother did, before he died." She went still. He said, "His name was Fletcher Ames. He rode with me for 20 years. I sent him here instead of coming myself because I was not well enough to travel. And Fletcher died on Route 12 4 months ago, with a brake line that had been cut clean, and an investigation that closed before anyone looked at the cut." Something moved across Ruth Greer's face. Something that had been locked in a specific position for a long time shifted by a degree. She said, "Fletcher was asking about Roy." He said, "Yes." She said, "He came into the diner twice. He was careful. He did not ask direct questions. He sat and he listened and he talked about mechanical things. He said that was how he worked." She said, "He left on a Wednesday. He was dead by the following Tuesday." He said, "Yes." She untied her apron. She set it on the counter. She said to Sadie, "Watch the floor for a few minutes." She went into the back. Hank waited. Sadie came to stand at the end of his table again, not sitting, just standing. She did not say anything. She was watching the kitchen door. Ruth came back with a manila envelope. It was standard size, not heavy, sealed with tape that had dried slightly at the edges from age. She set it on the table in front of Hank. She said, "Roy brought this to me 8 months ago. He sat in that booth right there." He was calm. That was what scared me most. Roy upset was easy to read. Roy calm and deliberate about something meant it was serious. She sat down across from Hank in the booth. She said, "He told me to keep it somewhere no one would look. He told me if anything happened to him, I would know what to do. He told me if nothing happened to him, he would come back for it in a few weeks, once he had figured out who to take it to." Her jaw tightened. She said, "He never came back." Hank looked at the envelope. He did not open it yet. He looked at the seal and the tape and the specific weight of it resting on the table between them. He said, "Did you open it?" She said, "No. I thought about it many times. I almost took it to the county sheriff 4 months ago. Then I thought about how Loomis and that office talk to each other. And I put it back." He said, "You were right not to." He picked it up. He held it for a moment. He was thinking about Fletcher. About a man who had come to this diner twice and sat and listened and left on a Wednesday and was dead by Tuesday. About a man who had been meticulous and careful and good at his work, and who had died anyway because careful is not always enough when the other side does not care about the same rules. He set the envelope back on the table. He said, "I want to tell you something about Fletcher before I open this." Ruth looked at him. Sadie was still standing at the end of the table. He said, "I sent him here instead of coming myself. That is the fact of it. I was in a hospital bed in Albuquerque, and I had a name on a piece of paper, and I had a man I trusted more than anyone I had ever known. And I said, 'Go look at this while I recover, and I will come down when I am mobile again.'" He looked at the table. He said, "He died before I could get here, and I have been driving toward redemption for 4 months, trying to find the right angle to come in from, trying to find the shape of what he found before he was killed, so I would not be walking in blind." He said, "I walked in blind anyway. I stopped because it was raining." He said, "The thing I want you to understand is that I am not here to take something from this situation. I am not passing through. I came to finish what Fletcher started because Fletcher started it, because I asked him to, and he died because of that asking." and there is only one way I know how to answer that." Ruth looked at him for a long time. She said, "Open the envelope." He opened it. Inside 4 photographs printed on standard paper, the edges slightly soft. He laid them on the table in a row. The first showed a truck parked behind the Carver Road substation, the abandoned one on the county road east of town that everyone knew existed, but no one officially used anymore. The truck was white crew cab, and even in the grainy print, the license plate was readable. The second showed a closer angle of the truck bed, a tarpaulin cover partially lifted, and underneath it, without any ambiguity, packages wrapped in uniform plastic, stacked in 2 careful rows. The third showed a man in a law enforcement uniform at the side of the truck. The face was half turned, but the patch on the sleeve was sharp. Redemption Sheriff's Department. The fourth was different from the others. Tighter zoom, better angle, a separate occasion. The deputy's face was fully visible. Young, 20-something. Name tag readable, Case Stokes. Deputy Kyle Stokes. And beneath the photographs, a folded piece of notebook paper in handwriting that was small and precise. The handwriting of a man who taught himself to write neatly as an adult. Hank unfolded it. Roy had run the license plate. He had a contact at the DMV, a man he had done free brake work for over 2 years. And he had run the truck registration through him and cross-referenced it 3 times on 3 separate days, and written the verification date beside each check. The truck was registered to Mayor Walt Crenshaw, not his official vehicle, his personal vehicle, registered to his home address, title in his name. And at the bottom of the page, a list of 4 dates and 4 names, and beside each name a dollar amount. 3 of the names Hank did not know. The 4th name was Judge Vera Payne. $60,000 spread across 3 payments, each listed with a date and what Roy had noted as a wire transfer reference number. Roy had tracked the money through his DMV contact and through a second contact whose name he had written down and bracketed with the notation confirmed twice. And below the list, in slightly different handwriting, slightly different pressure, as though written on a different day after a pause, the relay. This is what they call it. It is not just redemption. There are relay points across the state. Small towns. Too small for agency attention. The local law in each one gets paid to look away. The product moves through on regular schedules. The mayor's truck is one of the transport vehicles. Loomis runs the protection. Payne signs whatever needs signing. Roy had written I was there on a breakdown call. Someone's car had gone off the shoulder near Carver. I came around the back of the substation and found them loading. I stayed in my truck. I started photographing before I understood what I was seeing. And then I understood what I was seeing. The last line. If anyone reads this, I have tried to be careful. I do not know if careful is enough, but I have tried. Hank folded the paper, placed it back with the photographs, held the envelope in both hands. Ruth and Sadie were both looking at him. He said, "This is enough to open a federal investigation if it gets to the right person. And the right person is not anyone connected to this county." He said Roy was careful. He was right that careful is not always enough, but he was right to be careful. And he was right to leave this with you. And the fact that it exists and is sitting on this table is because of decisions he made before he died. And I need you to understand that. Sadie was very still. Her hands were flat on the table. Her face was doing the thing it did, controlled holding, not breaking. Hank said, "I have a contact, FBI, Phoenix. I have known him for 19 years, and he has no connection to Loomis or this county or anyone in Redemption's system. He is the one person I can call who will not create a ripple that Loomis can feel. He said, but before I call him, I need to understand the full shape of what we have. Because once I call this moves faster than I can manage from a corner table. Ruth said, "What do you need?" He said I need to know if Roy left anything else anywhere. Another copy. Another piece. Ruth looked at Sadie. Sadie looked at Hank. Something moved in her face, not quite a decision. More like the arrival of a question she had been pushing down for 6 months because she had not had anyone to ask it with. She said Roy had a garage behind the house. He kept everything there. I have not been able to go in since he died. I have not been able to open the door. Hank said, I know. She said, do you think? He said, I think Roy was the kind of man who did not put everything in one place. I think he distributed the risk the way a careful man does when he understands that careful is not always enough. He said, I think there might be something in that garage that Roy put there specifically because he was afraid he would not get to come back for it. Sadie looked at the table. The diner was quiet around them. Ruth had not moved. The kitchen was still. Outside the window, the rain had finally decided to stop, and the desert was the clean, bright gray of a wet afternoon. The particular sharpness that the air takes on in Arizona. After weather, everything visible and precise and very far away. Sadie said, I will look. Hank said, you do not have to do it tonight. You do not have to do it right now. She said, I know. She said it the way a woman says something when the time for waiting has passed. And she has accepted that fact, even if the acceptance is not comfortable. He said, when you are ready, whatever you find or do not find, you bring it to me first. She said, all right. He said, and if anything feels wrong before that, if Loomis stops by again, if Vaught says something, if anything changes. She said, I know where you are sitting. He looked at the corner table, his coffee cup, the particular corner of the Desert Star Diner in Redemption, Arizona, that he had occupied for a day that had started with rain and a plan to drive through to Tucson and had become something else entirely. He said, yes. You know where I'm sitting. Ruth stood up. She retied her apron. She looked at Hank with the full assessment of 61 years of watching people in difficult situations sort themselves into the ones who stayed and the ones who didn't. She said, I have been running this diner for 22 years. She said, I have seen a lot of men walk through that door. She said, Roy trusted me with that envelope because he knew I would recognize the right person when they came. She paused. She said, I think he would have liked you. Hank looked at the envelope in his hands. He thought about Roy Colton, who he had never met, who had stood in the dark outside a substation with a phone in his hand and photographed something he was not supposed to see, and then done everything a careful man could do to make sure that the truth survived him. He thought about Fletcher, who had come here to find that truth and had died before he could bring it home. He said, I think I would have liked him too. He put the envelope in the inside pocket of his vest. He picked up his coffee cup. It was empty. Ruth took it from his hand and went to refill it without being asked. And the diner held them all in the gray Arizona afternoon. And outside the highway was wet and empty, and the desert was very large and very old and very patient. The way the desert is patient, in the way of things that have been waiting a long time and have gotten very good at it. The night after Loomis came in and looked at Hank and left without speaking to him, Hank drove to the motel on the edge of Redemption that had 12 rooms and a vacancy sign that had been on so long it had faded to a shade of pink that no longer communicated urgency. He paid for 3 nights with cash. The woman at the desk looked at his vest and said nothing about it, in the way that people in desert towns learn to say nothing about certain things. He sat on the edge of the bed in room 7 for a while, without turning on the television. He was thinking about Fletcher, not the way he usually thought about Fletcher, which was with the specific low burn of a man who has been carrying guilt long enough to stop noticing its weight, except in the small hours. He was thinking about Fletcher the way you think about a person, when the place where they died is close enough to feel when you are in the same town and breathing the same air, and the shape of what happened to them is becoming specific rather than general. Fletcher had driven into Redemption on a Tuesday morning. Hank knew this from the motel receipt in Fletcher's effects, which had come to him in a box 6 weeks after the accident, after the 30-day wait that counted as an investigation. Fletcher had checked into a motel 14 miles from here. He had checked in on Tuesday and paid through Saturday. He had died on the following Monday night. 6 days. Fletcher had been in Redemption for 6 days before someone decided he needed to stop being in Redemption. Hank lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about 6 days, and what a careful man could learn in 6 days if he was paying the right kind of attention. He thought about the envelope in his vest pocket, Roy's photographs and Roy's handwritten notes and the name, the relay, and the mayor's personal truck, and the payments to the judge spread across 3 wire transfers that Roy had tracked with the patient. Persistence of a man who was meticulous about things he cared about. Roy had done all of that. Roy had built a file that any federal prosecutor would call substantive, and he had done it alone without telling his wife and without telling the wrong person. And he had still ended up dead on a curve of Route 9 that he had driven 100 times. The question Hank kept returning to was the same question he had been turning over for 4 months. The question was not what Roy had found. The question was whether Roy had found everything or whether the part he had found was the part that was visible and whether the part that was not visible was the part that had gotten him killed. Because a man who photographs a deputy loading packages into a mayor's truck has found something significant. But that is not necessarily the thing that gets him killed. Men get killed when they find the piece that, if it surfaces, cannot be managed. The photograph can be explained. The audit trail can be muddied. The deputy can be transferred, and the mayor can survive a scandal. If the scandal stays local, and the judge who signs the warrants is already in the arrangement, what gets you killed is the thing that cannot be managed. The thread that, if pulled, brings down the entire structure. Roy had been tracking wire transfer payments. 3 payments to Vera Payne totaling $60,000. Reference numbers written down. Contacts confirmed twice. Hank had been doing this kind of work in various forms for 42 years. And what he knew about wire transfer reference numbers was that they trace back to accounts. And accounts trace back to structures. And structures have names attached to them that go beyond the names of local sheriffs and small-town mayors. The relay was not a local operation. Local operations do not pay judges with wire transfers that have reference numbers that can be traced. This was organized above the county level, possibly well above it. Roy had been tracking something that had routes he had not fully mapped yet. And either he had known that and been moving toward it when he was killed, or he had not known it and had been killed preemptively by people who understood the risk better than he did. Either way, there was more than what was in the envelope. Hank was certain of it. He woke at 5 in the morning without an alarm. The motel was quiet. The desert outside his window was the particular dark of the hour before any light at all. The last dark of the night before the sky begins to consider other options. He sat up, made coffee on the small maker the motel provided, sat in the single chair by the window with his mug, and looked at the dark. He thought about calling Marcus Hale. He had been thinking about calling Marcus Hale since yesterday afternoon, when the envelope had come out of Ruth Greer's back room and landed on the table in front of him. Marcus was the one person he trusted with this kind of information. 22 years of knowing a man was not a guarantee, but it was as close to one as Hank had ever come to believing in. And Marcus had been FBI for 14 years now. And he had never once made Hank regret trusting him. But calling Marcus started a clock. Marcus was careful and thorough, and he would not move until the case was built correctly, which was the right approach, and also meant that the moment Marcus knew about redemption became a federal investigation in progress, which meant anything Loomis had that was surveillance adjacent would eventually pick up a vibration. Federal investigations created ripples even when they were kept tight. Someone talked to someone who mentioned something to someone who was in the wrong orbit, and suddenly the thing you were trying to build quietly had been noticed by the people who most needed not to notice it. Hank needed more before he called Marcus. He needed what Roy might have left in the garage. He needed Silas Webb, whose name Roy had written in the notes as his DMV contact, and who had confirmed the plate 3 separate times, and who had been conspicuously silent for 6 months. He needed the shape of the whole thing before he handed it to someone whose job was to build cases that went to trial. He went to the diner at 7. Ruth was already there. The coffee was already on. She put a mug in front of him before he sat down, and she did not say anything. But the set of her expression said she had not slept much either. Sadie came in at 7:30. She had changed her clothes and her hair was down instead of up, and she was wearing a jacket against the morning chill that had a tear at the left cuff that she had not mended yet and probably had not noticed. She sat down across from Hank. She said, "I went to the garage last night." He waited. She said, "I stood outside the door for about 10 minutes. That was the hard part. Opening it was easier than I thought it was going to be." She put her hands on the table. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the table with the expression of a woman going back over something. She said, "It smells like him. The garage. Oil and metal and something else that was just Roy. I had forgotten about that smell. I have been avoiding it." She paused. She said he had a false panel behind the rear tool chest. I did not know it was there. The chest is bolted to the wall, and the panel is in the wall behind it, the same color as the drywall. You would not find it unless you knew to look, or unless you were being very thorough. She reached into the pocket of her jacket and set a phone on the table. It was a basic model, the kind sold without contracts for cash at convenience stores, what people called a burner. It was in a Ziploc bag. The bag was sealed. The phone inside looked new or nearly new, and it had been charged recently because the battery indicator visible through the bag was full. Hank looked at it. He said, "Roy charged it." She said, "Yes. There is a charging cable plugged into the wall behind the panel." The phone was plugged in. He wanted it to be ready for whoever found it. Hank looked at the phone for a moment without touching it. He thought about a man setting up a panel in his own garage wall, charging a phone, leaving it there, In the specific way you leave something when you are not certain, you will be the one to retrieve it. The patience of that, the acceptance that was built into that kind of preparation. He said, "Have you looked at what is on it?" She said, "Yes." She said, "There is one file. Audio. 11 minutes." She said, "I listened to it twice." He waited. She said, "It is Roy. He is outside. You can hear the wind and the sound of a car idling somewhere nearby. He says the date and the time at the beginning very quiet, almost a whisper. And then you hear voices from what sounds like a building. 2 voices inside, one outside on what I think is a phone." She put her hands flat on the table. She said, "One of the voices inside is Loomis. I know his voice. I have heard it enough in this diner to know it without any doubt." She said, "The second voice is Crenshaw. Walt Crenshaw's voice. I do not know him well, but I have heard him speak at town events enough to be certain." She said, "The third voice is on speakerphone. You cannot hear it as clearly, but you can hear what the other 2 say in response to it. And from their responses, you can understand what the third person is telling them." He said, "The relay." She said, "They use that word. Crenshaw says it twice. He says the next relay cycle is set for the 14th, and that the northwest route is clear. Loomis says something about a problem that got handled. He does not say Roy's name. He does not say any name. He says the problem got handled." Hank said nothing. She said Roy recorded that audio 6 days before he died. The diner was quiet around them. Ruth was in the kitchen. Dennis Vaught had not come in yet. The early morning regulars were at the counter and in their usual booths, and the sound of ordinary breakfast filled the room with the ordinary texture of a morning that did not know it was different from any other. Hank picked up the bag with the phone inside. He held it in his hand. He said, "This is what they were afraid of. Not the photographs, not the transfer records. This." He said, "You can explain a photograph. You can explain a wire transfer if you have the right attorney and the right judge. What you cannot explain is your own voice on an audio recording saying the words that prove the arrangement." He said Loomis called it a problem that got handled. Roy documented Loomis calling Roy's death a problem that got handled. Before Roy was dead. She said, "Yes." He set the bag down carefully. He said, "You found this. You went into that garage and you found this. Without anyone asking you to, and without anyone telling you it would be there." She said, "Roy left it for me to find." He said, "He left it for whoever came." She said, "No." She looked at him with something very clear in her face. She said, "He left it for me to find. He knew I would come eventually. He knew it would take me a while. He charged the phone and plugged it in, and he knew I would come when I was ready. He was not counting on a stranger. He was counting on me." Hank looked at her. He said, "Yes." "All right." He said he was right to. She looked at the phone on the table between them. She said, "What do we do with it?" He said, "We make sure it cannot be lost. We need a second copy of everything. The audio, the photographs, the notes, everything that was in the envelope, everything on this phone. I have a man I can get it to tonight if we do it right." He said, "After that, I call Marcus Hale, but not until the copy is in someone's hands that Loomis cannot reach." She said, "Your people." He said, "One of them is in Flagstaff. He can be here in 4 hours." She said, "All right." He said, "There is one more person we need to find before I make that call. Roy's notes mention a contact at the DMV, the man who ran the plate 3 times and confirmed it. She said, Silas Webb. He has a shop on the south side of town. Roy and Silas have known each other for 15 years. He said, has he been in touch since Roy died? She said he came to the funeral. He has not called since. Not once. Hank filed this. Silence was rarely simple. Silence was usually either grief or fear. And in a town like Redemption, in the 6 months since Roy Colton died, a man who had helped Roy confirm the license plate of the mayor's vehicle, and had then gone entirely quiet, was more likely to be afraid than grieving. He was about to say something further when his phone vibrated on the table. He looked at it. An unknown number. He picked it up. Garrett Cole said, Hank, I am an hour out. You need me sooner. Garrett had been riding south from Flagstaff since 5 in the morning. Hank had called him the night before a short call, give no details over the phone call. Just, there's a town called Redemption. Come down. Drive by before you come in. He said, come straight in. Park on the south side of the building. He said, bring extra storage. We have materials that need a copy made and a copy secured somewhere outside this county. Garrett said, understood. Hank put the phone in his pocket. He looked at Sadie. He said Garrett will take a copy of everything and hold it outside the county until I tell him what to do with it. Once that is done, this town loses the ability to make any of this disappear. She said, and then. He said, and then I go talk to Silas Webb. Loomis came back at 11. This time he was in uniform. This time he had a deputy with him. A younger man whose name tag Hank did not catch from across the room. This time he did not sit at the counter. He walked directly to Hank's table and he stood beside it. And he looked down at the man sitting in the corner with his coffee and his vest and his 63 years. He said, don't believe we have been properly introduced. His voice was the voice of a man who has been making introductions on his own terms for a long time and has come to find the ritual pleasant. Hank said, Hank Dawson. Loomis said, Earl Loomis. I am the sheriff of this county. Hank said, I know who you are. Loomis pulled out the chair across from Hank and sat down in it without being invited. The deputy stayed standing near the door. The diner had stilled around them the same way it had stilled when Vaught hit Sadie, the collective inward breath of a room choosing not to be in this particular moment. Loomis put his hat on the table. He folded his hands on top of it. He was a man who understood how to make himself look comfortable in a space as a form of assertion, and he was good at it. He said, you have been here since yesterday morning. Hank said, yes. He said, most people passing through do not stay 2 days. Hank said, the coffee is good. Loomis looked at him, looked at the vest, looked at the patches. He did it with the attention of a man inventorying a situation not with alarm, but with the professional assessment of someone deciding what category of problem they are dealing with. He said, you rode in alone. Hank said, I did. He said, where are you headed? Hank said, Tucson originally. I may revise my plans. Loomis said, Redemption is a small town. Not a lot to hold a man's interest for very long. Things stay quiet here because people around here appreciate the quiet. He paused. They have a good thing in this town, and they would like to keep it. Hank said, that is understandable. Loomis said, men like you. He stopped as though choosing his next words carefully. Men with your kind of history on the road. They are used to places that have a certain kind of energy. Fast energy. Redemption is not that kind of place. Hank said, "What kind of place is it?" Loomis looked at him. He said, "It is a place where people mind their own business, and their own business minds them back." He said it the way powerful men say things that contain threats with the warmth of a man offering good advice. He said I would not want a visitor to get the wrong impression and end up somewhere he did not expect to be. Hank picked up his coffee cup. He held it in both hands. He looked at Loomis over the rim of it with the complete and unhurried attention of a man who has sat across from men like this before, who has sat across from men in considerably more difficult situations than this, who has been in rooms where the weight was real and the cost of the wrong response was permanent, and who has learned that the most unsettling thing you can offer a man like Earl Loomis is the evidence that his performance is not performing. He said, "I appreciate the advice." He drank his coffee. Loomis looked at him for a moment longer. Then he stood. He picked up his hat. He straightened his jacket. He said, "You enjoy your stay in redemption." He said it like a man closing a door. He and the deputy walked out. The diner breathed. Ruth came out of the kitchen 30 seconds after the cruiser left the parking lot. She stood at the end of Hank's table with a pot of coffee she did not offer yet. She said, "He came in uniform this time." Hank said, "Yes." She said, "That means the first visit was off record and this one was on. He is building a file, something that says he checked in with the stranger, and the stranger was uncooperative. Hank said he is also making sure I understand that he knows I am here, and he is not afraid of the fact." Ruth said, "Are you afraid of him?" Hank said, "No." He said, "But I respect what he is capable of." There is a difference. She filled his cup. He said, "Ruth, I need to go see Silas Webb this afternoon. What can you tell me about him?" She sat down. She put the coffee pot on the table. She said, "Silas has been a mechanic in this town for 25 years. He was one of Roy's oldest friends. They grew up 2 streets apart, and they could have conversations about engines that would clear a room of anyone who was not also a mechanic." She said, "Silas is not a complicated man. He is not built for this kind of situation. He does not have the instinct for it. Roy had the instinct, the patience, and the deliberateness. Silas has good hands and good loyalty and a temper he keeps mostly leashed." She said, "When Roy died, Silas went quiet in a way that I noticed immediately. It was not the quiet of grief. I know what grief looks like in a person. It was the quiet of a man who knows something he is afraid to carry, and equally afraid to put down." Hank said, "He knows what Roy found at the substation." She said, "I think he may have been there when Roy found it." Hank looked at her. She said Roy mentioned one time, maybe a year ago, that he and Silas had driven out to respond to a breakdown call together. A woman's car had gone off the shoulder near Carver Road. This was before everything, before Roy knew what the substation was. He mentioned it the way you mention ordinary things. She said, "I have thought about that since, about the timing of it against the photographs. Roy needed an angle to get close enough to the substation to see what was happening. A breakdown call on the road near it would give you that angle." She said, "If Silas was in the truck with Roy when Roy first saw what he saw, then Silas has been sitting on that knowledge for as long as Roy was, and he has been sitting on it alone since Roy died." Hank said, "Which means someone may already know about Silas. He was already reaching for his phone when it rang. Unknown number." He answered. A voice he did not recognize. Male. Somewhere in his mid-50s based on the register. controlled the way a person is controlled when they are saying something they have been rehearsing, when they have gone back and forth about whether to make this call enough times that the decision to make it has arrived at a particular finality. The man said, "My name is Boyd Tanner. I have been the clerk for Judge Vera Payne for 11 years. He said it the way a man states credentials when he needs you to understand quickly why what comes next matters. Hank said nothing. He listened. Boyd Tanner said, "I know what the judge has been signing. I have known for 3 years. I made copies of everything 2 years ago because I was afraid, and I did not know what else to do. And having copies felt like holding something that kept me alive, even if it also kept me scared." He paused. He said, "Judge Payne is signing a material witness detention order for a woman named Sadie Colton. It relates to a drug case involving a man named Silas Webb. The order will be filed in the morning, and Deputy Stokes has been instructed to execute it before the diner opens." Hank said, "When did you see the order?" Tanner said, "An hour ago. The judge left it on her desk when she went to lunch. She does not know I have seen it." Hank said, "You are still in town." Tanner said, "I am in my car. My wife is at her sister's house in New Mexico. I have been trying to decide since I sat down in this car whether to drive north or south." He said, "I am going to drive to New Mexico." He said, "I am going to take my copies with me. 11 years of them. Every order the judge has signed that was outside the normal process. Every case that closed when it should not have closed. And every warrant that was issued when there was no credible basis." He said, "I am telling you because I do not know who else to tell. I found your name through a contact who heard you were in redemption asking questions. I do not know who you are, except that you are not from here, and you are not afraid of Earl Loomis. And both of those things made you the safest bet I could find on short notice." Hank said, "You drive to New Mexico. You stop when you are across the county line. You call this number from whatever phone you are using now. And I will have someone at the county line to meet you." A pause. Tanner said, "You have people." Hank said, "I have people." Tanner said, "And the woman, Sadie Colton." Hank said, "I will handle Sadie Colton." Tanner said, "The order is for tomorrow morning, before the diner opens." Hank said, "I heard you." Tanner said, "I am sorry it took me this long. I have been afraid for a long time." Hank said, "You are calling now. That is what matters." He ended the call. He looked at the phone in his hand for a moment. Then he looked up at Ruth, who had heard his half of the conversation, and whose face was doing the careful, controlled work of a woman processing information faster than she wanted to. He said, "Get Sadie." Ruth went to the kitchen. Hank called Garrett Cole. Garrett picked up on the first ring. Hank said, "Change of timing. I need 2 things done before tonight. First, there is a man named Boyd Tanner who is driving from Redemption to New Mexico right now. He is going to call this number when he crosses the county line. He has documents that need to be received and secured and held. I need someone to be at the county line. Garrett said I can call Whitmore. He is in Albuquerque already." Hank said, "Do it now." He said, "Second thing, there is a mechanic on the south side of town, name of Silas Webb. I need to know within the next 2 hours if his shop is being watched. Garrett said I can drive that road." Hank said, "Do not stop. Just drive by. Tell me what you see." Garrett said, 20 minutes. Hank said, "Thank you." He put the phone down. Sadie came out of the kitchen with Ruth behind her. She looked at Hank's face, and she sat down across from him without being asked. He said, "Judge Payne is signing a detention order for you. Material witness in the Silas Webb drug case. They are planning to execute it tomorrow morning before you arrive at work." She said, "That is how they are going to do it." It was not a question. She had understood immediately, which told him she had been thinking about what the next move would look like. She had been thinking about it since yesterday. He said, "If they put you in custody under Loomis's jurisdiction, they control what happens next. They control what you are asked, what is recorded, what version of events gets built around you. And with Payne signing the warrants, every step of that process goes through her." She said Roy used to say that the most dangerous thing in a corrupt town is not the corrupt people. It is the legal structures they control. Because the structures make everything they do look like procedure. He said Roy was right. She said, "What do we do?" He said, "You do not run. Running confirms whatever story they are building, and it puts you outside the only protection you have, which is being visible and in public and surrounded by people." He said, "Tomorrow morning you come in early, before the diner opens. You sit at your usual table and you do your job. You are at work when they arrive. And when they arrive, everything that needs to happen will happen before they can execute that order." She said, "You said everything that needs to happen." He said, "I am calling Marcus Hale tonight." She said, "You said you needed more before you called him." He said, "I have more." "You found the phone. Tanner is running with 11 years of documentation. Garrett is about to tell me whether Silas is being watched and whether we can get Silas out and talking before Loomis moves. The shape of it is clear enough." He paused. He said, "There is a leak somewhere in the federal channel that Garrett tried when Fletcher died. One call to a contact in Phoenix and Loomis showed up at the motel the next morning. That is why I have not called Marcus yet. I have been waiting to be sure Marcus is the right entry point and not another hole in the dike." He said, "Marcus and I have known each other for 19 years. I trust him the way I trusted Fletcher, and I am aware of what that trust cost the last time. But the difference is that Marcus has been inside the federal structure and away from local Arizona politics for his entire career. If there is a leak, it is not Marcus. If there is a leak, it is in the chain that flows downward from Phoenix to county-level contacts, and Marcus knows how to keep something from flowing down that chain." She said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because I have seen him do it before." His phone buzzed. Garrett's shop is open. No unusual vehicles. One cruiser parked 2 blocks east, but it has been there since this morning based on the coffee cup on the roof, and it does not look active surveillance. Looks like a deputy sleeping off a night shift. And then a second message a minute later. "But Hank, the shop back door is open. I could see it from the road. Silas does not leave his back door open." Hank stood up. He said to Ruth, "If Dennis comes back, he is sick. He went home. He is not reachable." Ruth said, "Dennis is not here. He called in this morning and said he had a family emergency." Hank said, "Of course he did. He said to Sadie, 'Stay here. Stay visible. Do not go anywhere alone until I come back.'" She said, "Silas." He said, "I am going to his shop." She said, "Is he in danger?" He said, "I do not know yet." He was already moving toward the door when his phone rang again. Unknown number different from Tanner's. He answered it. The voice was rougher than Tanner's, older, the voice of a man who used his hands for a living and whose throat had been tightened by decades of oil fumes and solvent and the specific dust of garages. The man said, "You are looking into Roy Colton. Hank said, "Yes." He stopped walking. He stood just inside the diner door with one hand on the frame. The man said, "My name is Silas Webb. I have been trying to decide whether to make this call for 6 months. I am making it now because someone put a brick of cocaine in my garage behind my tool chest this morning. And I know what that means. And I know what comes next. And I have been afraid long enough." He said Roy trusted me with something before he died. Not just the plate. Something else. I am the only person alive who knows what it is. And if they arrest me this afternoon, whatever I know goes into a system that Loomis runs, and it never comes out. His voice was tight, controlled in the way of a man holding something together with both hands. He said I have 30 minutes before they come back with a warrant. My lawyer told me not to say a word to Loomis. I called him first. Then I called you. Hank said, "Why me?" Silas said, "Because Roy talked about a man who would come eventually. He did not know your name. He did not know when. He said, when someone comes who asks the right questions, you will know. And I have been watching this diner for a week, and you are the only person who has sat in that corner table for 2 days and not looked away from anything." Hank said, "Where are you right now?" Silas said, "Back room of my shop. I have not touched the package. I have not moved anything." Hank said, "Your back door is open." A pause. Then I left it open because I thought I might need to leave fast. Hank said, "Can you stay quiet for 5 more minutes?" Silas said, "Yes." He said, "Do not open the front door for anyone. Do not call anyone else." 5 minutes. He ended the call. He turned around. Sadie was already looking at him from across the diner with the alert stillness of someone who had been watching his face and reading it. He said Silas is at the shop. They planted drugs. He has maybe 30 minutes before they execute a warrant. She was already up from her seat. He said, "Not you." She stopped. He said, "I need Garrett at that shop, and I need him there in 4 minutes. And that means I need to make a call right now. And I do not need to be managing 2 different locations. You stay here. You call Marcus Hale, all." He was walking toward her as he said it, already pulling up Marcus's number. He held the phone out to her. He said, "His name is Marcus Hale. Tell him you are calling on behalf of Hank Dawson. Tell him we have a mechanic on the south side of Redemption with planted evidence and a warrant incoming. Tell him we have audio photographs, transfer records, and a judge's clerk running for New Mexico with 11 years of documentation. Tell him we have a live witness who is about to be taken into custody by the agency we are investigating. Tell him all of it. Do not leave anything out." She took the phone. She said, "And you." He said, "I'm going to make sure Silas gets out of that shop before the warrant arrives." He went through the door. Outside, the morning had become full and clear and bright, the way Arizona mornings become. After weather, the air washed clean, and the light coming down hard and specific, and the desert stretching in every direction with the impersonal honesty of landscape that does not make promises. He pulled out of the parking lot and drove south. The shop was on Birch Road. Garrett was already parked across the street when Hank arrived, visible but not conspicuous, the kind of parking that says someone is running an errand and will be back shortly. Garrett was 43 years old and had been riding with the Hells Angels for 16 years. And he had the specific body language of a man who was calm in situations that required calm, which was the only kind of man Hank invited into situations like this one. Garrett got out of his truck when Hank pulled up. He said nothing. He looked at Hank and waited. Hank said, "There is a man in the back room. He needs to walk out the back door and get into your truck before the cruiser 2 blocks east decides it is time to not be sleeping anymore." Garrett said, "How much time?" Hank said, "We are inside it. Go around the back." Garrett went around the back of the building on foot. Hank went through the front. The shop was quiet in the way shops are quiet when they have been recently abandoned by their usual rhythm. Tools on the workbench. An engine partially disassembled on the lift. The smell of oil and metal and rubber. And a life lived in proximity to machines. He went through to the back room. Silas Webb was standing near the workbench with his jacket on and his keys in his hand. A man in his mid-50s who was built in the way of men who have been doing physical work their whole lives. Wide in the shoulders and thick in the forearms, with a face that had been through weather and worry in roughly equal proportions. His eyes were alert and tired in the way of someone who had not been sleeping properly for months and had arrived at an endpoint where the sleeplessness had been replaced by a specific grim clarity. Behind the tool chest, clearly visible now that Hank was looking for it, a brick-sized package wrapped in clear plastic sitting against the base of the wall. Silas looked at Hank. He said, "You came." Hank said, "Yes. My driver is at the back door. You go with him now. You do not stop anywhere between here and the highway." Silas said, "There is something else." He reached into his jacket pocket. He took out a folded paper. He said, "Roy gave me this the week before he died. He said if anything happened to him, I should find a way to get it to someone who was not from here." He held it out. Hank took it. He did not open it. He said, "Get moving." Silas went through the back door. Hank heard Garrett's truck start. He stood in the back room of the shop for a moment. He looked at the package against the wall. He looked at the paper in his hand. He heard a cruiser slow on the street outside. He walked out the front door, got into his own vehicle, and drove in the direction away from the cruiser, at a pace that expressed no interest in the shop he had just left. He called Garrett. Garrett said, "He is in the truck. We are heading north." Hank said, "Stay off the main road until you are past the county marker." He said, "And Garrett, whatever Silas tells you in that truck, you remember all of it." Garrett said, "I always do." Hank drove back toward the diner. He drove with one hand on the wheel and the other holding the folded paper Roy had given to Silas. He unfolded it at a red light on the edge of town. It was not a long document. Roy's handwriting again, small and precise. At the top, a name, one name, and a phone number. And below the name and the number in Roy's careful print, "This is the account that funds the relay points, not the local payments, the source. I traced the pain transfers back as far as I could get. They originate from a holding company. The holding company is registered in Delaware. The registered agent is this name. And then I do not know who this is locally. I think this is above the county. I think this is the part that cannot be managed. Be careful. Be careful." Roy's last line. The same line he had used in the envelope. Hank sat at the light and looked at the name. He looked at it until the light changed. He thought about what Roy had understood, and what it had cost him, and what Roy had done with that understanding, which was to prepare as thoroughly as a man could prepare, and then go on living his life in the only town he knew until the thing that was inevitable finally arrived. He folded the paper. He put it in his vest pocket with the other paper Roy had left. He drove back to the diner. Sadie was at the counter when he came through the door. She had his phone in her hand, and she was still on the call. She looked at him when he came in. He crossed to her. She handed him the phone. A man's voice. Professional. Measured. The voice of someone who has been inside federal law enforcement long enough to have built a very specific kind of patience. The voice said, "Hank." He said, "Marcus." Marcus Hale said, "I have been listening to this woman for the past 20 minutes, and I need you to understand that what she has described to me is not a county corruption case." He said, "What she has described is a multi-jurisdictional organized crime operation with federal nexus, and I need everything you have in my hands as soon as you can get it to me through a clean channel." Hank said, "How long do you need?" Marcus said, "to do this right?" 48 hours, to position the team and secure the warrants from a judge in Tucson who has no contact with anyone in that county, and set up the kind of simultaneous execution that does not give anyone time to move anything or call anyone before it is over. He said, "Can you hold 48 hours?" Hank looked around the diner, at Ruth behind the counter, at Sadie, standing 2 feet away with the expression of a woman who had come to the end of 6 months of being alone with something impossible, and had arrived at the place where impossible things become the only available option. He said, "Yes." He said, 48 hours. "But Marcus, there is a detention order on Sadie Colton being executed tomorrow morning. You need to know about that." Marcus said, "I know about it now. I will deal with it from my end tonight." He said, "And Hank, that name you are about to give me, the holding company name, give it to me now." Hank unfolded the paper one more time. He read the name. Marcus was quiet for a moment on the other end. The kind of quiet that tells you the name has landed somewhere significant. Then Marcus said, "That is not a county problem." Hank said, "No." Marcus said, "That is going to require more than my field office." Hank said, "I figured." Marcus said, 48 hours. You hold the town, I will hold the warrants." He said, "And Hank, nobody else gets that name until I call you back." "Nobody." Hank said, "Understood." He ended the call. He set the phone on the counter. He looked at Sadie. She said, "Well." He said, 48 hours. She said, "And then." He said, "And then they move all at once. Everything at the same time so that nobody in this town can call anybody before it is over." She looked at the diner, at the tables and the counter and the jukebox in the corner, and the cracked tiles on the floor, and the kitchen where Ruth was already starting the lunch prep, with the specific rhythm of a woman who has been doing the same things in the same order for 22 years, and finds in that repetition not boredom but something close to peace. She said, "What do we do for 48 hours?" Hank said, "We work. We come in the morning and we do the job, and we act like tomorrow is a day that looks exactly like today, because the moment anything changes, Loomis changes with it." He said, "You have done that for 6 months already. You have been coming in here every morning and doing this job with everything you were carrying and not letting it show." She said, "Yes." He said, 2 more days." She looked at him. She said, "Can I ask you something?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Fletcher, when you think about him, what do you think about?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I think about the 20 years before this. I think about all the times I trusted him with something difficult, and he handled it better than I would have. I think about who he was before what happened to him here, he said, and then I think about what I am going to be able to tell him when I get to wherever we go. What I am going to be able to say I did. She looked at the counter. She said Roy used to say that the truth is heavier than a lie, but easier to carry over distance. He said lies compound. Truth is just the same weight every day. Hank said he was right about that. She stood up. She retied her apron. She picked up the coffee pot. She went to work. Hank went back to his corner table. Outside the window, redemption. Arizona held its shape in the afternoon light. Ordinary and still a small town. Doing the small town things that small towns do in the middle of their days. Unremarkable from any direction. The kind of place that a person driving through on the highway might see from a distance and not think much about. 2 days. He had held longer waits in worse places than this. He held his coffee cup and looked at the highway and waited. The night before it ended, Hank sat in his truck in the parking lot of the Desert Star Diner and did not go inside. He had been sitting there for 40 minutes. The diner was closed. The lights in the front were off, and the lights in the kitchen were off, and the only light visible was the pale glow coming from Ruth's apartment above the building, where Ruth Greer had lived for 20 years, and where the light would stay on late, because Ruth was not the kind of woman who slept easily when something large was happening in her vicinity. Hank had a cup of coffee from the gas station 2 blocks over. It was not as good as the diner coffee. It was barely coffee in any meaningful sense of the word. He drank it anyway because having something warm in his hands was the thing he needed, and the coffee was the nearest available warm thing. He was thinking about Fletcher, not the guilty version of thinking about Fletcher, which was the version he had been living with for 4 months. The version that came at 2 in the morning in motel rooms and on highway stretches when there was nothing else to fill the space. That version was a man turning a decision over and over in his hands, looking for the place where it could have been different, where he could have said, "No, I will come myself. I am not that hurt. Give me a week and I will drive down there myself." That version of thinking about Fletcher was useless, and he knew it was useless. And he had done it anyway because grief is not interested in being useful. This was a different version. This was Hank sitting in a parking lot in a small town in Arizona and thinking about the 20 years before the last 4 months. About the man who had been his brother in the way that mattered, the way that does not require shared blood, only shared years and shared work, and the specific knowledge that comes from being present for enough of someone's life that you understand the architecture of them, the things that held them up and the things that did not. Fletcher had been meticulous. Fletcher had been patient. Fletcher had been the kind of man who read a room by listening rather than looking, who built trust with people by not pressing for it, who had a gift for being easy to talk to that was not a trick or a technique, but simply an expression of the fact that he was genuinely interested in what people had to say. Roy Colton had the same quality. Hank had not known, Roy had never met him, would only ever know him through what he left behind. But the precision of the documentation, the distributed care of the copies, the specific attention to protecting the people around him from the weight of what he knew. That was a man who thought about other people's burdens as carefully as his own. Fletcher had recognized something in Roy across the table of this diner before he ever knew what Roy had found. Hank was certain of that. Fletcher recognized good men. It was one of his reliable qualities. 2 good men had died in this town because they had been careful enough to find the truth and not careful enough to outrun what finding the truth cost them. Hank was not going to find a way to make that all right. He had stopped looking for a way to make it all right somewhere around the second month. What he had found instead was the thing that existed on the other side of trying to make it all right, which was the simpler and more honest ambition of making it count for something. Roy had wanted the truth to survive him. He had distributed it in multiple places, charged a phone and left it hidden, trusted the right people with the right pieces, and hoped. Fletcher had come here and spent 6 days and assembled enough of the picture to write Roy's name on a piece of paper and mail it to Hank, which was the thing that had eventually brought Hank to this parking lot. Both of them had done their part. Hank was here to finish it. He sat in the truck until Ruth's light went off upstairs. Then he drove to the motel and lay on top of the bed in his clothes and looked at the ceiling, and was awake for a long time, and then was asleep. And then it was 4 in the morning and he was awake again, which was how it had been for 4 months. He made coffee on the motel maker and sat in the chair by the window. At 4:30, his phone buzzed. Marcus Hale. The text said, "Warrants signed 40 minutes ago. Judge, Rowan District of Arizona, Tucson. No Arizona County contact. Team is staged. We move on your signal at the courthouse, the mayor's residence, and the substation simultaneously. Give me the word when Loomis is in the room." Hank typed back, "Understood." 6 hours. He put the phone on the table and finished his coffee. He thought about what 6 hours meant. 6 hours was the distance between a town that had been running on fear and compliance and the deliberate management of silence and whatever the town would be after that. He had seen enough situations like this to know that the after was not a simple thing. The after was complicated and slow, and involved lawyers and testimony, and years of proceedings in communities that had to rebuild their understanding of themselves from the ground up. But the after also meant that when Roy Colton's name appeared in a document, it would not appear as an accident. And when Fletcher Ames's name appeared in a document, it would not appear as an accident either. And that was the specific thing Hank had driven to 6 towns in 4 months to make possible. Everything else was secondary. He drove to the diner at 5:50. Parked in the back, Ruth was already inside. He could hear the kitchen. She had been there since 5, based on the lights and the smell of the first coffee pot coming through the ventilation. He went in through the back. She looked at him when he came through the kitchen door. She did not ask anything. She poured him a mug and set it on the pass-through and went back to the grill. He took the mug to his corner table. He sat. He looked at the diner, at the 6 booths and the 8 counter stools and the jukebox in the corner and the cracked tiles and the sign above the coffee station that said, "Ruth's Roast" in letters Ruth had painted herself a long time ago. At the photographs on the far wall, redemption across 40 years. A town that had been other versions of itself before this version, and would be other versions again. At 6:45, the front door opened, and Garrett Cole came in. He was 43 years old and had the road still on him. The particular look of a man who had been driving in the dark for hours and had not stopped to process any of it. He sat down at the near booth, not at Hank's table, keeping the distance that the situation called for. Ruth brought him coffee without being asked. Garrett and Hank exchanged a look across the room. Garrett nodded once. It meant Silas is safe. It meant Boyd Tanner made it across the county line. It meant everything that needed to be in place last night is in place. Hank picked up his coffee. He waited. At 7:10, Sadie came through the front door. She was in her uniform, and her hair was up, and she was wearing the jacket with the tear at the cuff that she still had not mended. She came through the door the way she came through it every morning, with the economy of motion of a woman who had been doing the same thing long enough that the doing of it was in her body rather than in her thinking. But there was something different in her this morning, not in how she moved, in how she held herself while she moved. A quality of having arrived at something, of having made a decision, somewhere between waking up and walking through this door, that was not the same as the quality she carried on ordinary days. She came to Hank's table. She said, "I slept." He said, "Good." She said, "I thought I would not." I lay there for an hour, going over everything, and then I stopped going over it, and I slept. I woke up at 6, and I got dressed, and I came here. He said, "You came early." She said, "I wanted to be here. Not because anyone told me to be. I wanted to be sitting at this counter in my apron when whatever happens today happens. I wanted to be doing my job." She untied her apron from her waist and retied it with the specific knot she used, tight and level. She said Roy would have done the same. He would have gone into the garage and opened it up and started work and waited for what came. He was not the kind of man who ran. She said, "I am not either." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "No, you are not." She went to the counter. She started the second pot of coffee. She organized the sugar caddies along the counter with the absent precision of muscle memory. And she was behind the counter doing the opening work when the door opened at 7:30. The man who came in was 26 years old and wearing civilian clothes, and he looked like he had not slept in longer than one night. He was built lean and moved with the careful posture of someone who had been trained to carry himself a certain way, and was doing it now out of habit rather than comfort. He looked around the diner the way a man looks around a room when he is counting the exits and assessing the people, and has been trained to do both of those things so automatically that he cannot turn it off. His eyes found Hank. He came to Hank's table and he stood beside it for a moment. He looked at the other faces in the room, Garrett in the near booth, Ruth visible through the pass-through, Sadie at the counter. He was doing the calculation that every person did who walked into this room this morning, which was the calculation of understanding that the room had been arranged and that the arrangement was intentional. He sat down across from Hank. He put both hands on the table, flat palms up. It was a deliberate gesture, the gesture of a man who wants to be very clear about what he is not carrying into this conversation. Hank looked at his hands, then at his face. The man said, "My name is Kyle Stokes. I am a deputy in Earl Loomis's department. I've been a deputy for 3 years. He said I need to tell you something before the sheriff gets here, before anyone else gets here. I need to say it out loud to someone who is not part of the department, because I have been carrying it since the night Roy Colton died, and I cannot walk into what is going to happen today without saying it first." Hank said, "I am listening." Stokes looked at the table. He breathed in. He breathed out. The breathing of a man who has rehearsed what he is about to say enough times that the words are available, but the doing of it is still the hardest thing. He said, 18 months ago, Loomis told me that part of my job was to keep track of certain people in the county. Not surveillance in any official capacity, just awareness. He called it being a good community officer. He said certain individuals needed looking after, meaning he needed to know where they were and what they were doing and who they were talking to. He said one of those individuals was Roy Colton. He said 6 months ago on a Thursday night, Loomis told me to follow Roy's truck. When Roy left his house after 9 p.m., he said Roy had been behaving in a way that concerned him and that he needed eyes on the situation. He said it was routine. He said I followed Roy's truck north on Route 9. I stayed 2 miles back. I called in his position when he turned onto the county road near Carver. Loomis asked me where he was heading and I told him. Roy pulled off at a turnout near the creek. He paused. He said I called it in. I gave the exact location. He said, Loomis said, "Good, go home. I will handle it." He said those words. Go home. I will handle it. He looked at his hands. He said. 20 minutes later, the call came in for a single vehicle accident on Route 9. Roy's truck off the embankment. By the time I heard about it, I was at my apartment making something to eat, and the call came over the radio, and I stood in my kitchen, and I understood what I had done. The diner was very quiet. Sadie had gone still behind the counter. Hank could see her in his peripheral vision, not moving her hand on the coffee pot she had been about to pick up. Not picking it up. Stokes said, I told myself it was a coincidence. I told myself Roy had driven off that road because of a brake failure that had nothing to do with me following him and calling in his position. I told myself that for about 3 weeks, and then I stopped telling myself that, because I am not that person. I knew what I had done. He said 4 months later, a man named Fletcher Ames came to redemption. Loomis told me about him. Told me he was a biker who was sniffing around asking questions and that he needed to be monitored. Same thing. Eyes on. Nothing official. He looked up at Hank. He said, I am sorry. I'm going to say that knowing it is not enough, and knowing that no amount of saying it changes what happened. But I need you to hear it from me directly. Hank was looking at him, not with the particular heat of a man who wanted to express something violent, with the specific stillness of a man who has been waiting for the complete shape of something and has just received the last piece of it. He said, you followed Fletcher. Stokes said, yes. Route 12 north. I called in his position at a junction 4 miles outside of town. Loomis said the same thing. Go home. He would handle it. He said I drove home. Fletcher Ames was dead by the following morning. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight, the kind that settles into a room and stays. Hank looked at the table. He looked at his coffee cup. He looked at nothing in particular for a moment and did the internal work of receiving the complete truth of what had happened to Fletcher. The thing he had been building toward for 4 months. The specific knowledge he had needed and now had. And which was the kind of knowledge that does not make anything easier and makes nothing better, and is still necessary, because the only alternative is not knowing, and not knowing is a different kind of damage. He said, you came here this morning to say this before the FBI arrived. Stokes said, yes. He said, I am not looking for a deal. I am not here to negotiate. I followed 2 men on behalf of a man who used that information to have them killed. And I need to say that to someone who has the authority to hear it properly. Before anything else happens today, before I am in a room with attorneys and arrangements and the machinery that turns things like this into something that can be managed. He said I want it on record as something said freely, not under pressure, not as part of an arrangement. Just the truth said out loud at the first available opportunity. Hank reached into his vest pocket. He took out his phone. He placed it on the table screen up. He said, say it again. From the beginning. I need to make sure the right people have it clearly. He dialed Marcus Hale. Marcus picked up on the first ring. Hank said I have someone here who needs to make a statement. He is a deputy in Loomis's department, and he has information about the deaths of both Roy Colton and Fletcher Ames. He wants to go on record voluntarily before the action this morning. Marcus said, put him on. Hank slid the phone across the table to Stokes. Stokes looked at the phone. He looked at Hank. Then he picked it up and held it in front of him like a man holding something fragile and necessary. And he said his name and his badge number. And he said it again. All of it from the beginning in the same careful voice he had used the first time. The voice of a man who had made a decision and was committed to it. He talked for 11 minutes. When he was done, he set the phone on the table. Hank picked it up. Marcus said, I have everything I need. We are 40 minutes out. Hank said, he is in the building with us. Marcus said, keep him there. When we come in, he cooperates fully. Do you understand what I mean by fully? Hank said, yes. He ended the call. He looked at Stokes. He said, you stay here. When the federal agents arrive, you go with them. You do not speak to Loomis. You do not look at Loomis. You do whatever Marcus Hale's people tell you to do. Stokes said yes. He said, and Stokes. Stokes looked at him. He said, what you just did is not the same as what you did before. I need you to understand that. It does not undo it. But it is not the same thing. Stokes looked at the phone on the table. He said, Roy Colton deserved better. Hank said, yes. He did. He said, so did Fletcher Ames. He said, and now their names are in a federal record as something other than accidents. You made that possible by sitting down at this table this morning. I need you to hold on to that when the rest of it gets hard. Stokes nodded. He did not say anything else. He sat with his hands still flat on the table and looked at some middle distance and did whatever internal work a 26-year-old man does when he has put down something he has been carrying for 6 months, and discovered that putting it down does not feel the way he expected it to feel. The clock behind the counter said 7:58. Hank looked at the diner. Garrett at the near booth with his second cup of coffee. Ruth visible through the pass-through moving between the grill and the counter with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who had decided to spend this morning doing what she always did, which was feeding people and keeping the kitchen running. Because that was the thing she knew how to do, and the most useful thing she could offer to a morning that needed useful things. Sadie at the counter refilling sugar caddies she had already filled once the work of a person who needs to keep their hands occupied. 2 other men were in the diner. Hank had not introduced them to Sadie or to Ruth. They had come in separately in the hour before the diner opened and sat at booth 2 and booth 5 and ordered coffee and looked like men who were waiting for a bus. They were not waiting for a bus. They were 2 of Garrett's people younger riders who had come down from Flagstaff overnight, and their function this morning was to be present and visible, and to be the kind of present and visible that communicated a message without requiring words. The message was, this room has been seen. Whatever happens in this room this morning is witnessed. The clock said 8:03. Hank picked up his coffee cup. The door opened. Sheriff Earl Loomis came through it in full uniform with 2 deputies behind him and a piece of paper in his hand, and the expression of a man who has done this kind of thing before and expects it to go the way it has gone before. He had the bearing of someone who enters rooms and finds them already his, the bearing of authority that has never once encountered effective resistance. He took 2 steps in. He looked around the room. He counted the faces the way people count things when they are doing a rapid assessment. and the count does not come out the way they expected. His eyes move from booth to booth, from the counter to the corner table, from the two men at the booths he did not recognize to Garrett to Stokes, sitting at Hank's table in civilian clothes. He landed on Stokes. Something moved in Loomis's face. Not much. Controlled as always. But the fraction of a second where his expression did the unexpected arithmetic of the situation was visible to anyone who was watching for it. He came to the counter. He said, "Sadie, we have some paperwork we need to process. I am going to need you to come with us this morning." He set the paper on the counter. The detention order. Vera Payne's signature at the bottom. Sadie looked at the paper. She said, "No." The word came out of her the same way the word had not come out 6 months ago when she should have been saying it to Loomis, the same way it had not come out when Dennis Vaught had been speaking to her across a table about 60 cents and about who held power in this room. It came out flat and certain and without apology. Loomis looked at her. He said, "This is a lawful order signed by a judge of this county. You do not have the option to decline." He said it like a man who has said that sentence many times and has always found it sufficient. Hank said, "The order is void." He said it from his corner table without raising his voice and without standing up. He said it the way you say something that has already happened and simply has not been communicated yet. Loomis turned his head slowly to look at him. Hank picked up his phone from the table. He held the screen up so Loomis could see it. On the screen, Marcus Hale, FBI, Phoenix Special Agent in charge. The call was live. The timer was running. Marcus had been on the line since 7:50. Hank said Judge Rowan of the District of Arizona signed federal warrants at 4 this morning. Judge Payne's authority to issue orders in this county was suspended at midnight last night, pending a criminal investigation into her conduct. The detention order in your hand was issued after her authority was suspended and has no legal standing. He said it in the same level voice. Still seated. Still holding his coffee cup in his other hand. Loomis stood at the counter with the piece of paper and his two deputies behind him, and the face of a man doing very rapid calculations. One of the deputies shifted his weight. Garrett said from his booth, not loud, "Just clear, I would not do that." The man who had been at the booth by the window was now standing. He was standing with the specific posture of a man who is not blocking the door, but is positioned in a way that makes certain interpretations of the door much more complicated than they were a moment ago. The man at booth 2 had not stood up. He was sitting with both hands visible on the table and his coffee in front of him, and the expression of a man for whom the current situation was not alarming in any way that required him to change his posture. Loomis looked at all of this. He looked at Stokes sitting at Hank's table in civilian clothes with his hands flat on the surface. He looked at Hank. He looked at the phone screen. He said to Hank, "You do not understand what you are in the middle of." Hank said, "I understand it completely." He said, "Earl Loomis, you are under federal investigation for conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and 2 counts of accessory to murder in the deaths of Roy Colton and Fletcher Ames." He said it like a man reading from a list, because he was reading from a list. The list that had been building for 4 months across 6 towns and 4 days in this one. Loomis's face was very still. Hank said Marcus Hale's team is outside this building right now. A second team is at Mayor Crenshaw's residence. A third team is at the Carver Road substation. They are moving on my signal. He said, And before I give that signal, I want you to know something. He said Roy Colton was a meticulous man. He documented what he found, and he distributed the documentation, and he charged a phone in a hidden panel in his garage, and he left instructions in 3 separate locations for 3 separate people, because he understood that careful was not always enough, but he was going to be as careful as a man could be. He did all of that knowing the risk he was taking in a town that you have been running on fear for years. He said he did all of that because he believed the truth should survive him even if he did not. And it did. Loomis said nothing. Hank said Fletcher Ames came here to find what Roy found. He was my brother. I sent him instead of coming myself. And that is something I will carry for the rest of my life. But he found enough to point me here. And I am here. He held up the phone. He said Marcus. Marcus Hale's voice came from the phone, clear and professional, and carrying the weight of an institution that had spent the past 48 hours building something that could not be undone. He said, "We are executing. All locations simultaneously." The front door of the Desert Star Diner opened. 2 federal agents came through it in the specific economy of movement that federal agents use when they know exactly what they are doing and where they are going. Neither of them was hurrying. Hurrying implies uncertainty about the outcome. They were not uncertain about the outcome. A 3rd and 4th agent came in behind them. One of the deputies behind Loomis took a step back. Then he put his hands up before anyone asked him to, which was the decision of a young man who had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize what was happening and to understand that the fastest route through it was the cooperative one. The 2nd deputy did the same. Loomis stood at the counter with the void detention order in his hand and the expression of a man whose entire system of operating in the world has just been shown to be insufficient. He did not run. He did not reach for his weapon. He stood. The lead agent said his rights to him in a level voice, the same level voice that legal requirements have always required the words that mean what you say. From this point forward belongs to the official record. Loomis looked at Hank one more time. He looked at him the way a man looks at a problem he misidentified when he had the opportunity to identify it correctly. Hank looked back. He did not say anything. He did not need to. They took Loomis out of the diner. The 2nd deputy went with the agents willingly, quickly, with the relief of a man who had been wanting to be somewhere else for a long time and has finally been given a legitimate route there. The 1st deputy, the one who had stepped back and put his hands up without being asked, was asked a series of questions by a young agent with a notepad who wrote down everything he said in careful block print. Stokes was still at Hank's table. An agent came to him and spoke to him quietly, and Stokes stood and went with him, and as he passed Hank's table, he paused for 1 second and looked at Hank and did not say anything. And Hank nodded once, and that was enough. Garrett was on his phone. 2 calls in rapid succession. Hank caught the words Tucson and documents secured. And Tanner is with Whitmore, and that told him what he needed to know about that end. The diner had gone quiet in a different way than it had gone quiet before. Before, it had been the quiet of absence of people choosing to remove themselves from what was happening around them. This was a different quiet. This was the quiet of people who had been present for something and were sitting in the aftermath of its presence, the way a room is quiet after a storm has passed through it. Not the absence of weather, but the arrival of something that is not weather anymore. Ruth came out of the kitchen. She stood behind the counter with her apron on and her braid over one shoulder, and she looked at the door where Loomis had gone out, and she stood there for a moment without saying anything. Then she picked up the coffee pot. She went around to the remaining tables and refilled the cups that needed refilling. And she did not say anything, and neither did the people whose cups she filled. And the simple, ordinary act of refilling coffee in a diner in the morning was the most useful thing anyone did in that room in the 15 minutes after the sheriff of Redemption, Arizona was walked out of it in federal custody. Hank sat at his corner table. He sat there while the agents moved through the room completing their work, while Garrett made his calls and received his confirmations, while Ruth moved with her coffee pot, and Sadie stayed behind the counter. And the morning light came in through the front windows at the low, flat angle of a desert morning in October. Honest and specific and not inclined to make anything look other than what it was. At 9:47, his phone buzzed. Marcus Hale Crenshaw in custody. Substation secured. 7 individuals detained at the relay point. Drug evidence and transportation records seized. Judge Payne turned herself in through counsel 20 minutes ago. And Hank, Roy Colton. Case has been formally reclassified. Homicide investigation now open. Fletcher Ames also reclassified. Both cases are federal. Hank read the message twice. He put the phone on the table. He sat with that for a moment. Not as a feeling to be described, as a weight set down after a long carry the way you sit. After you have put something heavy on the floor and your hands are empty. And the emptiness is not nothing but something specific. Something that needs a moment to be what it is before the next thing begins. Roy Colton. Case reclassified. Homicide investigation now open. Fletcher Ames. Case reclassified. Both names in a federal document as men who had not died by accident. As men who had been killed because they had found the truth. And because the people who needed the truth not to surface had decided that killing the men who found it was the most efficient solution. As men whose deaths were now the subject of a federal investigation, rather than closed files that nobody was going to look at again. Hank thought about Roy leaving the notes and the photographs and the charged phone and the instructions distributed across 3 people. Preparing everything he could prepare and trusting that it would be enough. It had been enough. It had been more than enough. The careful man had been right to be careful. The careful man's carefulness had outlasted the thing that killed him. He thought about Fletcher writing Roy's name on a piece of paper and mailing it to Hank from a motel room in Flagstaff, 6 days before he died. Fletcher had known he was being watched. Hank was certain of that now. Fletcher had known the way a man who has been in enough tight situations knows that the room had changed around him, that the atmosphere had a quality that meant the window was closing. And he had sent what he had found to the only person he trusted absolutely. And then he had stayed and kept working because that was what Fletcher did. He had stayed because Hank had asked him to come. And he had worked until the thing that was going to happen happened. And then he had been gone. And the paper with Roy's name on it had arrived in Hank's mailbox 2 days later. And Hank had been sitting at his kitchen table in Albuquerque with his coffee and the piece of paper. And he had understood what it meant. He had understood immediately. And he had gotten into his truck. The rest had followed from that. 4 months of following, 6 towns, 42 years of being the kind of man he was, and 1 corner table in a diner in Redemption, Arizona on a rainy Tuesday in October, where he had watched a man hit a woman in front of a room full of people who chose not to see it, and he had made the only choice available to him, which was to see it and to not look away. Ruth set a fresh cup of coffee in front of him. He had not asked for it. He had not heard her come to his table. He looked up. She was standing with the pot in her hand and looking at him with the expression of a woman who has processed a very large thing in a very short amount of time and has arrived at a position of understanding that is neither relief nor celebration, but something quieter and more permanent than both. She said, "Roy would have liked you." He had told her the same thing yesterday in reverse. She was saying it back to him now, and it was not a repetition. It was a closing of something, a loop completed. He said, "I believe that." She put her hand on his shoulder briefly, not to say anything, just to say it. Then she went back to the kitchen. The morning continued. Agents came and went. Paperwork was produced and signed. Phone calls were made from the parking lot. The normal procedural apparatus of a federal action moving through its necessary steps filled the space around the diner with a purposeful activity that was not dramatic in any way, which was appropriate because the dramatic part was already finished. Sadie came to his table at 11. She sat down across from him for the first time since early that morning. She had her coffee in her hands, and she looked like a woman at the end of something large who is beginning to understand what the beginning of the next thing feels like. She said, "Marcus Hale called me. He said, Roy's case is a homicide investigation now." He said, "Yes." She said, "He said it will take time. Trials, depositions, years probably before it is resolved legally." He said, "Yes." She said, "But Roy's name is in it now, in the right way. Not as a file that was closed in 48 hours. He said, "Yes." She looked at her coffee. She said, "He was afraid for 3 weeks before he died. I know that now. He was doing the thing he always did when he was carrying something hard, which was to be very normal and very present and very careful not to put the weight of it on me. He made dinner and he asked about my day and he drove his usual routes and he serviced the truck on his usual schedule." She said I was so angry at him for that. For a long time. After. For not telling me. For deciding alone that the thing he had found was his to carry alone. She looked at the window. She said, "And now I am not angry at him for it. I understand why he did it, and I still think he was wrong, and I am not angry at him anymore." Hank said, "Good." She said, "I found the phone. I found it myself. He left it for me to find, and I went into the garage and I found it. That was mine. He gave me that." She said, "I think he knew I would be ready eventually. He just did not know when. So he charged the phone, and he left it there." Hank said, "You were ready." She said I was terrified. He said, "Yes. Those two things can be the same thing." She looked at him. She said, "Are you going to stay?" He said, "A few more days. Marcus will need me available while they process the initial stages. After that," he looked at the window, at the highway visible beyond the parking lot at the desert, beyond the highway at the enormous flat patience of the landscape that had been here before any of this, and would be here after all of it. He said, "There are other towns. There are always other towns." She said, "Is that enough? Riding to other towns?" He thought about it. He said, "I spent 4 months not knowing if it was enough. I'm spending today knowing that this particular thing was worth doing, and that Fletcher's name is in a federal record as something other than an accident. For today, that is enough." He said, "Ask me again in 6 months." She almost smiled. The whole smile arrived this time. Garrett came to the table at noon. He sat down in the chair beside Sadie, and he put his phone on the table between them. He said, "Whitmore confirmed. Tanner's documents are in FBI custody in Albuquerque. 11 years of signed orders. The Delaware Holding Company is being investigated by a separate federal task force in D.C. This goes further than Arizona." He said Fletcher found the corner of it. Roy found the middle of it. You found the whole thing. Hank said, "We found the whole thing." Garrett looked at him for a moment. He said Fletcher would have wanted to be here for this. Hank said, "Yes." He said, "He also would have been annoyed that I drove past 6 other towns before I got here." Garrett said he would have said you always took the long way to everything. Hank said he was right about that. Garrett almost laughed. Not quite, but close enough. At 2:00, Hank took his vest off the back of his chair and put it on. He picked up the envelope from his inside pocket, the one Roy had prepared, and he held it for a moment, and then he put it back. He left enough on the table to cover every cup of coffee he had drunk in 2 days, and then some, and he went to the counter. Ruth was there. He said, "The chicken fried steak is good." She looked at him. He said, "That is not the point I am making." She said, "What is the point you are making?" He said, "The point I am making is that this diner is good at what it does and it deserves to keep doing it. And the reason it gets to keep doing it is at least partly because Roy Colton sat in that booth 8 months ago and trusted you with an envelope." He said, "He trusted the right person." Ruth looked at the counter. She pressed her lips together once. She said, "You come back through if you are ever in Arizona again." He said, "I will do that." He walked to the door. He pushed it open. The desert afternoon was waiting outside. Clean bright, the air still carrying the specific freshness of the rain 2 days past. The parking lot was busy with the tail end of the federal activity agents, with documents and equipment loading into vehicles the practical machinery of a large operation, completing its visible work. He stood on the step for a moment. He heard a sound, a scraping rhythmic slightly above him. He looked up. Sadie was on a ladder leaning against the front of the building. She had a letter in her hand, the letter E, and she was holding it up to the gap in the Desert Star sign, where it had been missing for 8 months. She had the ladder positioned correctly, and the letter aligned, and she was pressing it into the bracket that had been waiting for it since it fell or was removed or simply gave out after years of weather. She pressed it in. It clicked into place. She came down the ladder 1 rung at a time, and she stepped off at the bottom, and she looked up at the sign. Desert Star. Complete. All letters. She looked at Hank. She said, "Thank you for not looking away." He looked at the sign. He looked at the diner behind it, at Ruth visible through the window, moving between tables at the cracked parking lot and the 2 splits running through it, and the desert beyond the road going all the way to the horizon. He said I should not need to be thanked for that. She looked at him. He said, "That is not directed at you. What I mean is that is what being in a room with another person requires. You do not look away. That is the minimum. Everything else is built on top of that minimum." He said Roy built everything on top of that minimum. So did Fletcher. He said, "So did you." She looked at the sign again. She said, "I think I am going to be all right." He said, "Yes, I think you are." He walked to his bike. He had checked it over that morning at the motel. The habit of 40 years, the pre-ride check that happened before every journey, regardless of distance. chain tension, brake lines. He had checked the brake lines twice. He would probably check brake lines twice for a long time. He put on his jacket. He fastened the vest over it. He started the engine. The sound of it filled the parking lot, the familiar sound of a road-worn Harley at idle, the rhythm that meant motion was available, that the road was ahead, and the direction was forward, and the distance was whatever it needed to be. He looked back once. Sadie was still in the parking lot with the ladder folded against the building. She raised her hand. He raised his. He pulled out. Route 9 south. The road that Roy Colton had driven north on a Thursday night 6 months ago and had not come back from. The road that Kyle Stokes had followed him down. The road that had ended one man's life because that man had been too careful and too honest and too unwilling to look away from what he found. Hank drove it in the other direction. He drove it with both hands on the bars and the desert opening on either side of him. In the way the Sonoran Desert opens in the afternoon, the light going from white to gold, and the shadows beginning to make their slow moves across the ground, and the air carrying the faint memory of the rain that had brought him off the highway and into a diner 2 days ago. He had not been planning to stop in Redemption, Arizona. He had stopped because it was raining. He thought about that, about the randomness of the thing that had brought him to a corner table in a cracked tile diner where a man had hit a woman in front of a room full of people, and he had been the only one who did not look away. He thought about how many versions of that morning existed where he had not stopped, where the rain had been less and he had pushed through to Tucson, where the diner had been closed, or the coffee had been bad, or he had simply chosen a different road. He thought about Roy Colton charging a phone in a hidden panel in his garage and trusting that someone would come, not knowing who, not knowing when, just trusting that the truth had a way of finding the people who were looking for it, if those people were willing to stay in the room long enough. He thought about Fletcher writing a name on a piece of paper and mailing it. He thought about Sadie going into the garage. He thought about Ruth holding an envelope for 8 months and knowing when the right person walked through her door that he was the right person. None of it had been inevitable. All of it had happened anyway. He opened the throttle. The road ahead was long and straight, and the desert was enormous and honest on both sides of it, and the sun was starting its afternoon descent toward the western edge of the sky, where it would eventually make the kind of ending that only deserts produce, vast and colorful and entirely indifferent to the human business happening in the roads and towns below it. Somewhere behind him in Redemption, Arizona, the Desert Star Diner was serving the afternoon rush with its sign complete for the first time in 8 months. Ruth Greer was behind her counter doing what she had been doing for 22 years. Sadie Colton was working the floor in her uniform with her hair up and the tear at her cuff still unmended, and Roy's name now attached to a federal investigation that would take years to resolve fully, and that would end with someone being held accountable for what had been done to him. And somewhere in Phoenix, Marcus Hale was building the case that would make that accountability possible. And somewhere in Albuquerque, Boyd Tanner's 11 years of documentation were in federal custody. And somewhere in a county holding facility, Earl Loomis was sitting in a room that, for the first time in his long career in this county, was not one he owned. Hank rode south. He was 63 years old, and he was tired in the way of a man who has finished something large and has not yet figured out what comes next. That was all right. The not knowing what came next was all right. He had been in that place before. The road had always offered a direction, even when the destination was unclear. There were other towns. There were always other towns, He rode into the afternoon, and the desert held him on both sides, and the engine spoke its familiar language, and somewhere behind him, in the clean Arizona air, the truth that Roy Colton and Fletcher Ames had each in their own ways given everything to preserve was on its way to becoming the kind of permanent record that even Redemption, Arizona could not close in 48 hours. That was enough. For today, in the only way that mattered, that was exactly enough.